thank you everyone for coming out at lunchtime today. I'd like to acknowledge a couple of people. First, my postdoc, Jamie Macbeth, is up here, and he's actually doing some follow-on research, which we can talk about a little bit later. And then my student, surprisingly, a former student who was actually a co-author on this paper, Armin Merchkin, he's here, and so he can also help fill in some of the gaps. So this is pretty informal. It's a small crowd, so I'm going to give a kind of a high-level overview of the paper, but feel free to stop me at any point in time if you have any questions. Okay, so I think this picture on the left really kind of sums it up. This is a picture. It was actually an advertisement for a company called the Napstrap Company. And it hooks to the back of your chair and it holds your head up if you're in some seated position. And this was actually a picture on the Napstrap's company trying to market its product until the two Northwest pilots overflew Minneapolis. And then I did an interview with Wired Magazine after that about how mind-numbingly boring flying at the altitude was. And I actually, in the interview, which was recorded, I said, and just go to the Napstrap website and you can see a perfect example of what pilots are doing to mitigate that. And then the next day, the picture disappeared. So in fact, if you want the picture, you can email me and I'll send you the presentation. But, you know, it's funny. Is it really that boring? I was a former fighter pilot, and I can tell you being a fighter pilot is pretty exciting, but for every pilot, regardless of what you're flying, when you fly from point A to point B and you have a lot of automation who is flying the plane for you, there's really not a lot to do. And so I had some personal background in the area of boredom, but then when I started working with the unmanned aerial vehicle operators, and I would sit in these trailers with them, and at first when you walk in, they would actually hide their newspapers and magazines and iPhones that they were playing on because they wanted you to think that they were paying attention. And then after you're sitting in there for several hours, they admit that they're really bored. And you're just watching a screen, and it's worse than just watching TV because you're watching a screen where nothing is changing. But I also work in other domains with process control, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and these are similar problems that everyone is having in these highly automated systems. And it's the classic piece of it is called the Vigilance Decrement. We know from years and years of research that humans can really only pay attention for about 20 to maybe 30 minutes. Those of us who are professors and or students in the audience could probably attest to that. I mean, I think my students get bored within 5 minutes. I see the texting starting, you know, almost instantly when we start sitting in class. So, you know, I think boredom is pervasive in all of our lives. And I think the flip side of that is now that we have technologies that can distract us, that we like to distract ourselves with, it's becoming more of a problem. And it's even problems, I've got a picture for anesthesiology. This is another mind-numbingly boring task. Once everything is settled and the patient is safely under anesthesia. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the UAV study that we did for this project. This is two screens that we developed with Aurora Flight Sciences just down the street on another research project, and I'm going to explain the background first of this because you have to put this into context of how did we even get inspired to do this study in the first place. Well, we have this, it looks like a video game. You're trying to watch multiple UAVs run around and search, and so they search and then they find a target, and then the human helps identify whether it's a good guy or a bad guy, and if it's a bad guy, we take the target out. If it's a good guy, we proceed to go on and look for more targets. And the screen on your right is actually a way that the operators can figure out whether or not the UAVs are performing well. This is basically a distributed environment where it's futuristic. There's a lot more smarts on the UAVs than exist in common systems today. So what we were looking at is task-based control versus vehicle-based control, you know, looking at how the human's coaching the entire team as opposed to maybe one vehicle at a time. And this is the original study. So this isn't the study in the paper. This is the study that motivated it. And we know that humans are needed for plan approval, but the question was, we were worried about overload, information overload. How often, if we ask the human constantly for help, where would we start to see human performance break down because they were working too hard? And so we were looking at 30, 45, and 120-second intervals. You know, the automation would wait a half a minute or it would wait up to 2 minutes and then ask the person for help. So, and this curve I've got up here, it's called the Yerkes-Dodson law. It's basically the representation that, and I'm sure we all can appreciate, that we work best under moderate levels of workload. If we work too hard, our performance drops off, but if we don't work hard enough, we get bored, complacent, and our performance equally drops off. So what you're seeing up here, and I've actually left a citation for this paper because this actually was a paper that it has a lot of implications, nothing to do with boredom, but just how well humans and computers can work together, and when they work together, how well can they do. But what you're seeing up here is these are three different categories. Dissenters are people who didn't like working with the automation. Consenters are people who liked working with the automation, and kind of the middle area. And what you're seeing is under the 30 and the 45 resecond intervals, people, when they were requested to replan that often, they would. But then we got to a really interesting point. Even the people who liked the automation, the consenters, they couldn't wait the full 120 seconds, meaning the computer would take 2 minutes to actually ask for help. These people were already exhibiting signs of boredom. They were insisting on helping after only 80 seconds. So we thought, whoa, we're on to something here. These people can't even wait 2 minutes. You're cutting off the automation, and why that's important is because the automation actually takes some time to develop a good plan. And so we saw these people cutting the automation off at the knees. Now, a little foreshadowing. In this study, those people who were video gamers with significant experience, they did fantastic. They were really in their element. The video gaming experience, and we've been seeing a lot in other studies in my lab, does help when people are working really hard. So keep that in the back of your mind. So that little block up there made us ask the question, well, if they're getting bored after 80 seconds, and we know that UAV operators in real life are sitting in trailers for hours and hours and hours, what are the impacts of boredom, and what can we study? What can we say when we see this? So we used that very same interface, and then what we did is we slowed everything way down. So there were only 4 vehicles on the screen, and only one target became uncloaked an hour, and it was a 4-hour study. And what that means is we released it in the software to be found, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was found. It just could be found. So if you were conducting a really great search, you might find one thing to do an hour. How does that relate to the real world? Most predator shifts are about 12 hours long, and if they get one thing exciting to do in a 12-hour mission, it's the exception. So it's actually, the pace of work could actually be, in reality, is much slower than this. But this was about as slow as we could do and still not feel terrible for our human subjects. So I'm going to show you some of the behaviors that we saw in this experiment. Oh, all professors know what this means. So we tested 3 people at a time, because we knew that's a good source of distraction, which is what happens in real life. Yawning leads to falling asleep. She slept this way for 30 minutes, right? Almost a half hour. Man, you think about the neck. This person, we didn't turn anything off in the computer system, right? So these clever MIT students, he found the Minesweeper game, and he said he had the best Minesweeper performance he's ever had. And oh, by the way, he fell into the top third of performers. So even though he was playing Minesweeper, he still managed to do a good job. So here we go. Here's the people in the background. This is what, yeah, now watch her. She's clearly not paying attention. And the other 2, who are actually students in my lab, are trying really hard to pay attention. And, they're not giving her the feedback that she needs, but she persists, and she successfully gets him to turn around. Now, you have to look at, this young lady right here. Very conscientious, trying really hard to pay attention. Meanwhile, there's this big political debate going on about health care in the background. And, she's working, and she actually looks like, if you can see her expression, she looks like she's in pain. And, she's moving around. And then she's about to give up the ghost. Hey, she can take it anymore. She reads her book. Now, why did people have to pay attention? When a vehicle was found, an alert sounded. So it wasn't that they had to pay attention for some major change in the interface. And we've had automation so good that we can signal that pretty clearly. And they had headphones on, and they visually got an alert. So they would know if something major happened. The reason they had to pay attention is the automation was trying to figure out the best search patterns in the interface. And the automation wasn't necessarily doing anything bad, but it wasn't setting up the most optimal search pattern. So a human had to pay attention every so often just to make sure that the vehicles were distributing themselves correctly, that they weren't spending too much time in an area where a target had recently been found. And oh, by the way, the targets also moved. So just because you found one in one area doesn't mean that another one couldn't show up there at some other point in time. So you had to basically develop your own strategy for searching. So the automation, it wasn't doing anything wrong, but like all automated algorithms, particularly that do search, it was inherently brittle and imperfect. Now, one of the things that we did is we videotaped just like you saw, and we also had cameras on each person too, so we knew what they were looking at. Overall, what we found was that, you know, about 30% of the time people were looking at the interface, we say directed, divided about 20% of the time, and that means they were doing two things at one time. They may be looking at the interface and eating, they may be looking at the interface and talking, but we coded these states as the eyes had to be on the interface. That doesn't necessarily mean they were thinking about it, but we coded it that way because if any visual alert popped up, they saw it, right? And then distracted, in this case, was their body was in a physical position such that they could not see the interface. Now there's a lot of ambiguity. People want to say, well, what's distraction? But we coded it this way so that we could say absolutely, without any ambiguity, that that person could not see the interface, so they were distracted by something else. So in fact, these are conservative numbers. About over 40% of the time people were distracted. It was probably much more, because even though their eyes were looking at something, they may not have been thinking about it. And then over here, what we're seeing the reaction times throughout the hours of the experiment. And so what you see is the chat time, that there was a little chat window that they would have to answer questions, and that's how we tested whether or not they were paying attention to their supervisor. You can see that those times went up, except a little decrease in the last hour, and I'll talk about it in a second. The search times, they kept going up and up and up. And this is actually, and the replan times also kept going up, and then a little taper at the end. These consistently upward trends, which means they were getting longer in their reaction times, classic vigilance literature. We know that people, not only do they not pay attention as well over time, but there's clearly, and that's one of the things we're looking at now, is how predictable is this linear increase over time? Can we actually predict about a 20% decline over time for your attention state? And then, although in the last hour we saw a couple of the metrics drop back down, and anybody want to guess why they think that happened? People's performance picked up a little bit at the end. Why? They knew it was a 4-hour study, and so there was a lot of excitement about ending this study. Now, I want to go back to the gaming experience. We ran some statistical tests and found out that the gamers were statistically worse performers than if you did not game. Now, I don't mean to overemphasize that point, but I'll tell you, it's a small sample. To get statistical significance at the degree that we did, it's actually very hard to do, which just goes to show you how pronounced it was. Our video gamers were probably the first to become distracted and start doing other things because they were not in their element. They were used to the constant stimulation. They sought out the constant stimulation, and it just didn't happen. So I don't want you to try to look at this data too much in detail. I just want you to take the Gestalt pattern view. So these were our worst performers. The red basically shows you the level of distraction. So our two worst performers, they start out, actually they started out more directed, and then they were distracted. And then, of course, over time, the level of distraction grows. These are students in my class, by the way. Our second worst performer had a similar pattern, a little bit more mixed strategy. But this was our best performer. And remember, red is the level of distraction. This young lady needs to be cloned and put in every nuclear process control plant that we have because she managed to hardly ever be distracted, and she had a nice balance between divided and directed. This graph right here, I mean, this is what we want to believe that everyone is doing when we put them in charge of safety critical systems that maybe have these long periods of operation. She was the exception rather than the rule. I mean, it is true she won, and by winning, she actually won, I think, $200 gift certificate, or was it $250, something like that, and that's how we bribe people to take part in these experiments. But this was our second best performer, and what's interesting is he only finished about 1% difference in the performance score than this young lady. But you can see his pattern is completely different. It's all over the map. And in fact, if those of you who love sinusoid curves, you can actually see that his attention, his ability to pay directed attention had an amazingly sinusoidal effect. So what he was doing, and by the way, he was the guy that turned around in the video that you just saw. So he had this amazing innate ability. There was no training. We gave them no hints on strategies for playing the game. He would talk to the girl next to him, and then he would look back at the interface every so often, and then he would talk to her. And then what would she do? It's kind of funny, in natural conversation between two of us, if you're talking with somebody and they look away, you might look away too. And instead of looking at her interface, she would actually look down at her laptop or some other thing that she was doing. You laugh, but I'm afraid that this is what we're seeing in a lot of areas of life. I mean, there's distraction, and instead of actually forcing yourself to pay just enough attention, you'll actually either get overly fixated or attend to some other new task. So the other point that I want to mention here, which it came out in the paper, but it was basically a very small mention, is just how little time people are spending in divided attention. And this has been getting a little bit more press in the recent years, but it's something that we all think that we're excellent at. We think that we're excellent at multitasking and dividing our attention. And one of the points that came out of this paper is that consistently everyone basically sought between a 10% divided attention state. Very few ever got over that. Even our young lady who, she was divided, had some divided attention, but she oscillated around, a little bit higher, but still, not as nearly as much as you think that we would be. And there's been some growing evidence to show that we like to think that we can do two things at one time, and there are some cognitive abilities that we have to do two things at one time on different channels. And by that I mean we actually can listen and see at the same time. And we hear this when we drive, we're hearing honking, we're visually changing our world. But when it comes to complex problem solving, which is what's happening in most of these domains, and it's certainly happening when we have a conversation, we tend to shift our cognitive resources to that channel that's demanding the most of our attention. And this is why talking on your cell phone, regardless of whether you're holding it in your hand or you've got a headset, it's equally dangerous, because the conversation is the complex cognitive task, not the driving or not necessarily the listening. And your attention in your head foveates on the conversation and effectively killing your peripheral vision, and you're not scanning as much as you should. So we even see that in this domain as well as others, is you think you're good at multitasking, and I know I am because I used to fly fighter jets, and I was trained, but we think we are, but we're not really as good as we think we are. And I think we need to accept the fact that we might be able to do a couple of things for a little bit, but it's actually mentally exhausting, and we're going to go into some kind of receiving state, meaning we're eventually going to end up in a distracted state, or maybe a directed state if you've got those genes like that young lady did. But for the most part, we are going to get distracted in these long duration, low workload environments. And why I think that that's important in the practical world is, recently, I'm sure many of you remember in the news, the FAA seemed like they were firing air traffic controllers left and right because they were sleeping. They were found sleeping at 2 a.m. Or one poor guy was trying to watch movies to stay awake, and then he and the supervisor got fired and there was nothing going on at 4 a.m. And then the FAA came back out with this scathing response about how their air traffic controllers were not behaving in a professional manner, and if they were really professionals, they would just make themselves pay attention. And I think that kind of totalitarian response ignores the basic human condition. It also ignores the fact that we live in a different world. I was complaining to somebody the other day, for those of us who are older, and by older I mean over 40, we can actually remember standing in line and not having anything to do, right? So I just went to a coffee shop. I went to Flowers right before I got here. The line at Flowers is ridiculous. Every single person is head down in the line on their smartphone, right? There could have been a car could have had a massive 3-car pileup outside of Flowers, and no one would have noticed because we're all heads down. We have grown into this society where we're not patient, thus, because we can get that stimulation even in the most dull moments of our lives, where 20 years ago, you know, that's how they actually caught a bunch of FBI most wanted, because you didn't have anything else to do in the line at the post office except look at those pictures of the most wanted. But I don't even think that's important anymore. Now what we should do is the post office should just randomly, you know, send to your phone pictures of the most wanted, because that's the only way you're going to see them anymore. So we live in a different culture, and we live in a different world where you can like it or not like it, but young people today have access to a lot more information. The air traffic control community, as well as the nuclear process control community, and especially the UAV control community, is having problems with recruitment and retention. And so if we're going to get people to do these mind-numbing jobs for the bulk of their time, we need to start thinking about how we can help them not be in pain, like the young lady you saw in the video, and actually help them get more out of their jobs. Okay, with that, I'll open up the floor to questions.